welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very happy to bring the conversation I had with Paula Fredriksen. Paula is Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She is Professor of Scripture Emerita at Boston University and Distinguished Visiting Professor Emerita in the Department of Comparative Religions at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She holds degrees from Wellesley College, Oxford University, and Princeton University, and is widely published on the social and intellectual history of ancient Christianity and on pagan-Jewish-Christian relations in the Roman Empire. She is the author of numerous books, including the most recent, Ancient Christianities, the First 500 Years, and that's what we talk about in the conversation. We start by talking about how there are many early Christianities, right? It's not just one Christianity. There's many different types and sects, after, Jesus ascends to heaven, as it's said in the Bible, and what the early church was doing in the first and second centuries. We discuss some of the contradictions within the New Testament and how there's some difficulty with trying to hold what a scriptural text like the Bible says, albeit an ancient historical text of sorts, but not specifically history, at least not objectively. We talk about the integration of Jews and pagans in the Mediterranean in the first century and this idea of the Jewish Diaspora. We talk about the crucifixion of Jesus, the idea of Israel, and persecution of early Christians. We also talk about early eschatology, early church fathers, Constantine, and many other topics. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. I think Paula is extremely erudite. She is, you can tell she has a big love for this topic. And it was really nice for me to talk about some topics I haven't talked about in many, many years. And so she's just a wealth of knowledge and information. It's just absolutely fantastic. The book is great, highly recommended. And now I bring you Paula Fredriksen. I am here with Paula Fredriksen. Paula, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm greatly looking forward to talking with you.
I'm looking forward to our conversation too.
Very, very, very good. You have a really, really wonderful book that's out. It's called Ancient Christianities, the First 500 Years. And I greatly enjoyed it. It was very, very, very good. So we're going to talk all about it. Could you just give us real quick a snapshot of just kind of who you are professionally, academically, all the relevant details there?
Let's see. Standing on one leg, I have degrees from Wellesley College in Religion and History, from Oxford University in Theology, and I received my PhD in Mediterranean Religions from Princeton University. I've been a historian since 79 when I got my degree, and I've written several books on ancient Christianity, and ranging from topics on the historical Jesus and on the Apostle Paul, and also on Augustine, and also on Origen, who's a second, third century church father. And so I thought it would be fun to try to pull all of that stuff together in one narrative recounting. And the result of it is the book we're talking about now, Ancient Christianities.
That's very, very nice. Yeah, it sounds like you have such a wealth of knowledge and experience. And so, yeah, putting it all together in this book, you can see all the threads there. So that's great. So with this book, it's Ancient Christianities, plural. Most people, when they think of the religion of Christianity, they think of a religion, Christianity, and that maybe it's just one history, or they were taught something one way. But how do we, from history, understand that at the very least, at the outset, there are multiple histories that kind of make up multiple Christianities? Could you explain this kind of concept here about these multiple Christianities?
Sure. I mean, partly we're dealing with the problem of rhetoric versus reality, because we talk about the triumph of Christianity as if it were just one type of, as if Christianity were only one thing, or we talk about the church, again, as if it were only one thing. But when we have our earliest evidence of what will become this movement with the letters of Paul written in the middle of the first century, Paul is spending a lot of his time complaining about and yelling at other apostles of Jesus who are saying slightly different things to other groups of ex-pagan pagans. So already from the earliest time we have any evidence, there's already evidence of multiplicity and controversy. And it certainly doesn't diminish as time goes on. I have to say, too, that spell check has a nervous breakdown whenever I put Christianities in the plural into my text, because that's how hardwired this idea of one single Christianity is. So we're swimming against the tide here.
I had the same problem in my document. I was like, why does this keep saying, no, it's wrong? Like I looked at it like 3 times. It's very funny. So many people, they get their information from the Bible, right? Old Testament, New Testament. But obviously there are many other historical sources. Obviously for religious folks, the Bible is not just a book. It's not just a history book or whatever any of these other things. It's a holy text for believers. But I guess for you as a historian, how do you kind of marry these two things? Of there's some stuff in the Bible, obviously that's has historical implications, but then we have other text outside of the Bible that many times will contradict what's there, sometimes not, or it will kind of give a different perspective. How do you kind of find the marriage between those things as a historian?
Well, I am used to reading. Let's just take the New Testament. I'm used to reading the text very closely, and it's clear from reading the New Testament there are, if we want to look at it as historical reports, we're going to get a headache very quickly because there are head-on collisions with different things, like, not to mention Paul's letters, as we just reviewed, having reports of controversies. But just taking, for example, 2 familiar instances, the stories about the birth of Jesus, which appear in Matthew and in Luke. Those stories were written probably in the closing decades of the first century, so 40 to 70 years after Jesus' execution. And in Matthew, Jesus and Mary's hometown is Bethlehem, and the Magi come, and then they flee to Egypt, and then they go to the Galilee when they're finished hiding in Egypt, and they settle in Nazareth. And that's how that particular writer resolves the problem of claiming Jesus is the Messiah when he's known as Jesus of Nazareth, but Bethlehem is the Davidic messianic town par excellence. So that's Matthew. The Gospel of Luke has Jesus in Mary's hometown as Nazareth, and then a call goes out that all the world must be taxed, and Joseph and Mary go down to Bethlehem just in time for Mary's delivery, and then they stop at the temple on their way back home and present Jesus at the temple, and then they go back home to Nazareth. Mary and Joseph's hometown cannot be both Bethlehem and Nazareth at the same time. So this is a way of cluing us as readers that neither Matthew nor Luke is reporting historical data. What they're reporting, or what they're giving evidence of, is the way that each of them individually is reading their Jewish traditions about messianism and Davidic descent, and crafting 2 different stories that resolve this conundrum of Jesus of Nazareth having to be born in Bethlehem if he's considered the Messiah. So we don't even have to go outside of the New Testament to see that the New Testament is not a historical document. It's a religious document, a spiritual document, a rhetorical document, a political document, but it is not transparent on historical fact, which is the case for most narratives that come out of the ancient world.
Yeah, I've read at different points that this idea. So we know a lot about, obviously, the Roman Empire at different stages and of the world of that time, and so there's no. You correct me if I'm wrong here. When it says that there was this kind of you know tax across the empire, or whatever, it doesn't seem like in the historical evidence that that was the case. No, is it that when they said they were supposed to go down and pay a tax, was that really something that happened, or?
There is, it's, how shall I explain it? If a student had been writing this for me, I'd give them a B minus and the option to rewrite. When Luke says there's this big tax, the story actually is that after Herod the Great dies, his three sons divide up his kingdom between the three of them, and the son who gets Judea and Jerusalem is named Archelaus, and he makes such an administrative mess of his territory that Augustus fires him in the year +6 and brings that chunk of Herod's kingdom under direct Roman administration, which means that just the territory of Judea has to have some kind of census so that the Roman Empire can know what the administrative expenses are going to be to govern that particular province. Which means that if there's a tax, and we know about this from Josephus, Quirinius is the Syrian legate, the local honcho in Antioch, who's responsible for the eastern edge of the Mediterranean. This means that if there's a tax going on in Judea because of this provincial administrative situation, and Mary and Joseph are living in Nazareth, they're not subject to the tax anyway. So those are two contradictory things that are just in the Gospel of Luke itself. Also, please note that Herod the Great dies in -4, but which means Jesus would have to have been born sometime in -6, according to the Gospel of Matthew. So again, the chronology is very loose as well. These are documents that aren't concerned with historical facticity the way that we are.
Yeah, I guess that's the sort of the takeaway here, is that it's really hard to kind of know, okay, like if you're going to read the New Testament as a kind of authoritative account of everything that happened. I mean, that becomes quite difficult to do. And of course, people can read it for spiritual, religious value of sorts, but it does become difficult to kind of see with the contradictions within the Bible. So obviously, you're talking about, we have the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then you have John after that. And I think Mark is kind of the earliest, if you will, but it's still 30, 40 years after the death of Christ. And then you get, I think John was written, almost 100 years or 80 to 100 years afterwards. So, you have these long periods where these things are then kind of written down. And so when we start to look at history and early history of what's going on, it does seem to become challenging of sorts, of saying, okay, the reader has to make a decision, right? Of okay, what am I going to believe here, right? What am I going to try and do, not religiously, but historically? It's like, okay, like this stuff is not trying to give a historical account, and so I think that's one of the really nice things about kind of your work, is trying to say, okay, how do we understand some of the history here?
Well, it's my point in reviewing what I did is that you don't have to go outside of the New Testament to encounter historical problems. You mentioned the Synoptic Gospels, the seen together Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as opposed to John. In John, Jesus dies the day before Passover starts. In the Synoptic Gospels, he is arrested the night of Passover. So you have two different chronologies just between those Gospels. Again, you don't have to look at archaeological evidence. You don't have to look at Josephus. You don't have to look at Roman records to see that there are historical tensions, and which means that the authors weren't really thinking about the way we think about historical facticity. And that's okay, because they were ancient people. And our concern with facticity is a post-Renaissance post-Enlightenment problem, which first century people can't be responsible for.
Mm, mm. So tell us about the kind of landscape, if you will, of kind of ancient Christianities, I guess. You do such a nice job of giving us the kind of the overview of what's kind of going on. So during this time in the first century AD, you talk about the Jews being in many places in the Mediterranean. They had adopted the Greek language, even served in foreign armies. And so you have this discussion about Jewish folks in pagan spaces and doing pagan things, and pagans doing and Jewish spaces doing Jewish things. We a lot of the times, if you read some of the stuff in, we'll get to the Pauline epistles, but in Acts and the Pauline epistles, you'll see this very seemingly dichotomous kind of, ways of living. The Jews live over here this way, and the pagans live over here, the Gentiles this way. But you kind of seem to say that that's not quite the case. Can you tell us about this kind of integration of sorts in the ancient Near East?
Well, it's if you look at it as Mediterranean culture, all of these different types of ethno-religions are, and Judaism is not the only ethnically based religion. All religions are ethnically based in antiquity, which means that if you tell me you're from Alexandria, I know immediately what gods you worship. If you tell me you're from Rome, I know what gods you worship. So there's this linkage between ethnicity and religion that continues more or less to be true for Judaism today, but in antiquity was normal. Now, when you think of empire, what you're dealing with is a huge collectivity of different ethnicities brought under the umbrella of one political administration, which means that the Roman Empire was full of gods. All different ethnicities had different gods, and the evidence of the existence of the gods is the existence of the people who are worshiping them. So it's a culture where the existence of all gods is taken as granted. So again, both in the Jewish Bible and in the New Testament, Paul has a sentence where he says, "We all know there are many gods and many lords." 1 Corinthians 8. But for us, there is one God the Father and one Son, one Lord Jesus Christ. So he's immediately acknowledging that there are other gods. Rule of thumb is any God is more powerful than any human. So even if a particular God isn't your God or the God of your people, if you're in that God's territory, you're going to try to be polite to the locals, and the God is local as well as the people are local. So you have Jews showing respect, but not cult, not sacrificing to foreign gods, but they're certainly polite to them. If they're in the army or if they're a town councilor, they'd be present when cult acts are performed to these other gods. You also have pagans who go on tour, religious tourism to Jerusalem, and they worship in the Jerusalem temple. They don't sacrifice, but they can certainly pray and they can certainly give offerings at the temple. And you also have foot traffic through diaspora synagogues of interested pagans. So it's a kind of comfortable, practical pluralism. It's not rigidly divided. Now, when we look at ancient texts that are about identity, you get this insistence on clarity and difference that doesn't quite measure up to the social reality of how people and gods are actually interacting in the ancient Mediterranean.
Let me ask a little kind of a footnote here. You mention it in the book. You say how many times in modern times we use the word diaspora, but you say that in this Mediterranean region, this term's a little bit misleading. That the Greek is really for dispersion, but as you're saying, there's an integration here. How do we consider the kind of if you will, like sort of the collective of Jews in this region at this time? what did they see themselves as a kind of diaspora, or was it just more of a nope, we're Mediterranean folks, just like there's other folks here, my neighbor in the next town or whatever? How do we kind of just see this, maybe just as a footnote here about what's how to kind of see the grouping here?
Well, diaspora as a term, dispersion, implies a kind of forced exile. You're dispersed out of your homeland. And that might have been true in the -6th century when Babylon conquers Judea. But it's certainly not true after Alexander the Great, because when Alexander brings the Eastern Mediterranean under his political hegemony, what you have is voluntary migrations of different people, Jews among them. So you have a voluntary migration, a voluntary dispersion of Jews. Jews adopt Greek as their vernacular. They even translate their scriptures into Greek, centuries before the birth of Christianity. So each ethnicity has its own ancestral customs, but that also means that each group is aware that there are other ancestral customs to other people as well. So Jews aren't living in ghettos in their different cities. They're integrated just like all the other immigrants are in these different Mediterranean cities. And that's why you have all these different religions cheek by jowl, because you have all these different populations cheek by jowl.
So I guess the one question I have here is about, you have this idea here where, in the New Testament, Jesus comes, he has his whole message, he's executed. There's been some, you mentioned a little bit in the book about, there's some idea about some traditions or some people at different points in history, blaming the Jewish people for Jesus' death. And there's these kind of strange historical kinds of things. I mean, is that too fine of a point? Does it really matter? Why is there some of these kind of events that where people will say, well, this kind of happened, there's, how popular was Jesus? How much did Pilate intervene? Was there some priestly cooperation here? What do we, and then, that, the Jews killed Jesus, these kinds of things. Like, what do we make about these kinds of statements, in terms of, obviously, yeah, like we were talking earlier, I can read, open the New Testament, read the Gospels, here's the account. But historically, in various traditions of church fathers, you'll have different ideas here and it kind of changes. And what can we make about some of these, historical events?
You're talking specifically about the crucifixion of Jesus?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, that happens, we guess, more or less around the year 30. I also want to point out that Jesus' vernacular would have been Aramaic, which is a first cousin of Hebrew. And all of the documentation we're talking about now is written in Greek. So there's already been a cultural and linguistic translation from a local culture in and around Judea to a more international frequency. What you have in the 4 different Gospels are 4 different accounts of how Pilate and the people are interacting. And here's another speed bump. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is so popular in chapter 14, verse 1 and 2. He's so popular that the priests decide that they want to arrest him surreptitiously off stage because he's so popular that if they arrest him out overtly, there'll be a riot among the people. And then you have Jesus's arrest, and then you have him before Pilate, and all of a sudden you have all of Jerusalem yelling at Pilate to crucify Jesus. There's no explanation whatsoever in the text for that transition between heightened sympathy and heightened hostility. So something's going on in the story right there. We know that from other sources, from Philo of Alexandria, who's an elder contemporary of Jesus and of Paul. We know from Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, that Pilate had a terrible reputation as somebody who was brutal and well known for the execution of untried prisoners, which could fit very easily what happened with Jesus. What you get beginning with the gospel stories and then progressing through second and third century traditions is you actually have a situation where it goes from Roman soldiers doing the crucifixion, which historically could only be the case. I mean, Jews weren't crucifying people in the first century. You get a story of Jews themselves actually becoming the executioners. And already in the late second, early third century, you have a church father, Tertullian, writing in Latin, saying that Pilate himself converted to Tertullian's idea of third century Christianity. And he wrote to Tiberius, the emperor, saying that the Jews made him do this, but they were wrong to, and that Jesus is actually divine, and Tiberius should take that memo to the Senate. And Tiberius does take it to the Senate, and the Senate says, no, we're not voting on this, and they table it. The whole thing is fantasy. But what it does is let you have this trajectory, because why blame Jews? Because you have the invention of different identities, and you have this one Gentile group or several Gentile groups that are trying to figure out what their relationship is to Jewish scriptures, which is the only Bible there is. There isn't a New Testament for centuries by this period. So you don't have an Old Testament until you have a New Testament. So there's a contest going on for the correct ownership or readership of Jewish scriptures in Greek. And one of the ways you get to claim these really belong to my side and not your side is to villainize the side that's your competition. And I think that's partly what's going on with these toxic traditions that develop around the crucifixion of Jesus.
Yeah, let me continue with that. You know, there's this idea of Israel, right? There's not one single, Gentile church, and as you say already, and we see this in Acts, we see this in Paul's letters, that there's churches that start to become churches everywhere. What was this interaction between Jews and Gentiles? You're saying here, like, Gentiles are trying to, or different types of groups are trying to see how do they fit? What's the cohesive kind of, connection here with, Jewish, history, culture, with the Old Testament, things like that. So in directly after, as the story goes, directly after the death of Christ, and you have these early churches that are springing up, how did these different groups try to stay connected together? And then as we see in Paul's epistles, we see that they're dispersed all throughout Asia Minor, kind of modern day Turkey. And so, what does that look like? How were they trying to do it in, 150 AD, 200? How are they trying to figure this out?
Well, one of the ways they're figuring it out is condemning other people who also call themselves Christians who have a different construction of Christianity. Right? Tertullian goes after Marcion, who's a very important Christian theologian. He just happens to read scripture differently, and Tertullian is absolutely livid about it. Tertullian vilifies Valentinus, who's another important Christian theologian. Probably our audience hasn't heard either of Marcion or of Valentinus, and that's because they lost the 4th century power struggle when imperial Christianity kicks in, and that's when you get a stable New Testament collection. But in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, what you have is not only great Christian diversity, but you have great Christian intra-Christian hostility because of this project of evolving the identities of different communities. I also want to back up and say that just as there's no single Christianity, there's no single Judaism either. We know of Pharisees, Sadducees, people in Alexandria doing different things in different ways. So Judaism is no more uniform than is Christianity. And that's the problem with using both of these terms in the singular. There is no Christianity. There are different types of Christianity.
Is it really the, I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but, is it really when we start to see empire start to take a hold of Christianity and kind of centralize it. And then we see, throughout history how that works. Catholic Church, things like that. Eventually, but is that where we kind of get the centralized, here's how we're going to do things, here's a kind of structured hierarchy of Christianity as we know it. But until that point, we're just getting lots of localized kind of communities having different types of Christianities. Is that a fair way to say it?
Right, and there's a loose coordination of different, you can use the word church at this point rather than just assemblies. Different churches that will be in correspondence with each other. So somebody in southern France can write a treatise, and we know from papyrus that within several decades, people in Egypt are reading the treatise because we have it, some fragments of it on papyrus, that's pretty extraordinary. So you have efforts at coordination and very strong local traditions all at the same time. Christianity isn't centralized after Constantine. What happens is that the emperor becomes a patron of just one type of Christianity, and the difference that makes is that they get infusions of power because of infusions of wealth from the emperor, because that's what a patron does. He distributes favors. And that's when you get the ascendancy of one particular type of group over the other different Christian groups. It's not centralized, but Constantine has to make a call about who's the bishop that he agrees with, because that's the bishop he's going to patronize.
I see. Well, going back to kind of the early kind of these early communities, you talk about it. There's this one chapter in the book about in the New Testament, in Acts, we hear lots of accounts, and then in the epistles, but in Acts, you see this idea about Christians, various Christians in different places being persecuted, and that there's this almost, tell me if I'm wrong here on this, but there's this sort of exaggeration of this kind of narrative. I guess what's the evidence that we have of these early Christians being persecuted for their faith or suffering martyrdom? Were these just kind of off things, outliers that happened, or was this really kind of a frequent thing? What's the kind of story here from what we know from Acts in the New Testament?
Acts really doesn't have much about persecution of Christians. Paul tends to consider any type of frustration that he experiences a sort of persecution. And he has, in 2 Corinthians 11, he gives a list of some of the frustrations he's dealt with. He's disciplined by synagogue communities by receiving what's called the 39 lashes. So, which means that they consider him Jewish, or they wouldn't be doing that. And he considers himself Jewish, or he wouldn't be voluntarily subjecting himself to the authority of the synagogue. He also says he was 3 times beaten with rods, which is a Roman administrative punishment, probably for disturbing the peace. Romans were very big into domestic calm, as you would expect an empire to be. And if Paul was receiving that type of negative attention from Roman magistrates, it's because he was having some kind of tumultuous effect on a particular city. And we get a story about that with Ephesians in the book of Acts. So Paul considers that persecution. When he's frustrated, when he gets hostility, he says he's being persecuted by false brothers, by whom he means other people in the Jesus movement with whom he disagrees. And he says he's being persecuted by pagans and mob violence. And he's in danger from weather and flood and famine. And he's just always having all these troubles. And the message is that he will prevail over these troubles. And the fact that he's having troubles is evidence of sort of the darkness just before the dawn. Paul expects Jesus to come back within Paul's own lifetime. So he's not imagining a standing situation of persecution. He's imagining a moment of dramatic reversal when Jesus comes back and Paul gets to tell everybody else, you see, I was right after all. Once you have the movements variously letting go of that expectation of the imminent return of Jesus, you have different groups settling in different ways in different Mediterranean cities. And we don't really know why Christians would have been, quote, persecuted. We know we have an epistle from a Roman governor in Bithynia that talks about having Christians in his courtroom. We know that we have a lot of complaints about persecution in different Christian texts. And then we have stories about martyrs. But again, it's hard to tell what the historical traction is to those stories, because a lot of the point of the stories is to articulate a precise and clear, definite Christian identity. And nothing articulates our identity better than conflict. So these stories are very dramatic. They're very exaggerated. And we happen to know that after the conversion of Constantine is when you get most of the martyr stories written, which means that it's after a period of persecution has really stopped for one of these churches that you get the more and more of these stories being written, because there's such a vibrant, interesting, powerful narrative way of communicating the principles of a crystallized identity. So it's, again, to get back to your original question, the martyr stories are no more transparent upon what we consider historical fact than any other type of writing in this period. It's about persuasion and rhetoric.
Yeah, that's very illuminating in many regards for how we see some of these accounts. You mentioned there about Paul, and I'm curious here. What did these early different types of early Christians, did they literally believe in their lifetime there would be a second coming? I mean, how much do we actually know that? And I guess just more larger question here is, what were the different, I guess, ideas of this kind of eschatology, right? This kind of end times, what happens when we die, the afterlife, things like that. There's obviously stuff in Jewish literature that says, some things about the afterlife. We start to get a lot of specific things from Paul's epistles. Obviously, First Corinthians, you have it in where's else? It's somewhere else.
First Thessalonians, you have it in Philippians, right?
That's right. So you start to get this kind of structure of what's going to happen in the afterlife. I mean, how much of that? I mean, just to kind of fast forward all the way up to current day. I mean, that's very motivating for many people today. I mean, how much was it motivating, or in the minds of kind of these early Christians in the early times after the death of Christ?
Well, the point of Jesus' death is his resurrection, right? Which is supposedly an end-time miracle that late Second Temple Jews talk about expecting a resurrection at the end of time. So if Jesus himself is raised, it's not supposed to be a one-off resurrection. He's the first robin of the eschatological spring. If Jesus has been raised, then that means that the general resurrection, which is an end-time event, is just around the corner. And this is where First Thessalonians is very interesting. It's Paul's earliest letter, maybe written in the late 40s. And he's writing back to a community that's upset because some of the members have died before Christ comes back. Now, the only place they would have gotten the information that Christ is coming back before anybody dies is from Paul. And Paul writes this letter back and says, don't worry, things are happening on time. Those who have died have fallen asleep. So he doesn't have them hanging around in heaven or in hell once they're dead. They're fallen asleep. They're in a quiescent state. And Christ is going to come back soon. And we who are alive, who are left, will be transported with the dead who will rise, and everybody will be with Christ in the end. So that gives you an idea of the intensity of the expectation Paul has that Christ is coming back within his own lifetime, and the intensity of the expectation on the part of the Thessalonians. And Paul says throughout his letters, he says in 1 Corinthians, he says in Romans, that the time is at hand, the day is at hand, the time has grown very short, the ends of the ages has come. So he's really expecting this eschatological roundup of a general resurrection to be effected in his own lifetime. Once you get the expectation of an imminent end quieting, that's when you get the evolution of elaborated stories about souls going to heaven or to hell, and then there being, once Christ finally comes back, some kind of resolution where the people in hell are there permanently and the people in heaven are there permanently. You have fights over whether people in heaven are going to have physical bodies or not, or if the bodies are going to be made of spirit. So again, it's there's no uniformity of thought, but there's an opportunity to develop stories about heaven and hell, which are pagan ideas too, right? Pagans have ideas about paradise and about Tantalus, so heaven and hell. So this is again something that's part of the Mediterranean-ness of this religious movement.
Well, we start getting into, as we move further away from the death of Christ, and we get into the 3rd and 4th centuries and things like that. How did, I guess, you have these early church fathers like Origen that help define kind of the triune God. We start to get this kind of doctrine, these sort of dogmas and doctrines that we see from the New Testament. How do we start seeing this kind of evolution of people starting to now write down and start to say, okay, here's what we're thinking about how we can kind of put this together in terms of certain doctrines that we, at least the early precursors of what we kind of see today in Christianity?
Well, what you have is an intelligentsia, which doesn't represent, just how much do current Christians know about cutting-edge academic theology? Not very much, and they don't have to, right? So what you have is an intelligentsia who has a good philosophical education, or else they wouldn't have the means to articulate what they're trying to say. And you have these people writing theology for each other. And then eventually what you have is the boiling down of these complicated theologies into simple creedal formulas, which is like, taking War and Peace and boiling it down into one soundbite. And it's about war. So the theology is something that happens at a very high radio frequency, but it's not something that necessarily affects. Most people wouldn't have the time or the education to try to figure out what it means to have God be 3 in 1 and 1 in 3. You need a lot of philosophy to be able to articulate that. That idea of God's threeness, by the way, also is native to Roman period Neoplatonism.
Could you say more about that?
Sure. The idea of God in Roman antiquity is that God is this one single, ultimately transcendent source of everything else that is. And then you have God divided up into a God that is so transcendent that he's virtually unknowable. And then you have God as he contemplates himself. And then you have God as he affects the organization of the cosmos. So you have this kind of triplicateness. I can hardly talk about this. Triplicateness in the Godhead. And what you have in the Christian versions of this is the assignment of different personalities. You have Christ obviously assigned to the as the image of God. And then you have the Holy Spirit eventually being promoted as the final third of the Godhead. But that takes centuries to do and a lot of philosophical education.
It's just so interesting how these things, there's so many things that we know, or if anyone's been adjacent to Christianity today, and we just kind of have these things, but these ideas come from somewhere, and there's an interesting history and what their kind of roots are and precursors are and antecedents to them are. This is all very fascinating. So we mentioned Constantine, so let's talk about him here. You were saying something really fascinating earlier about that. So obviously, people know that Constantine he has his conversion. From what I've learned about this is his conversion. You tell me how this sits, from how you understand it. His conversion, at least the explicitness of his Christianity, was sort of a slow burn, a kind of a slow rollout. It wasn't it wasn't like boom, one day, here we go, guys. It was more of like this kind of slow rollout, which is interesting. This is very, very interesting. What can you had started on it? What can we say definitively, I guess, or what do we know about the kind of uh, what it was? If it wasn't centralized, what kind of these various Christianities that Constantine was trying to or was converting to, how much did he influence or infuse some, pagan ideas that were already there that people did? Just tell us about the importance of it, but really what it was specifically of his conversion to Christianity.
Well, it's first of all that idea of a singular point being the moment of dramatic reversal, where Constantine's pagan, he's pagan, he's pagan, and boom,
Right.
suddenly he's Christian. Is something again that's a terrific story. We have two different versions of it, one in Lactantius, one in Eusebius, and one Constantine has a dream, and in the other he sees a sign in the sky, which is the more familiar story. And both writers claim that they got this particular conversion narrative from the horse's mouth, so to speak, from Constantine himself. Those are two different versions. Probably the reason Constantine ends up patronizing the community that he does is because that was the version of Christianity that he was familiar with in England and in the north of Europe, which is where his father's territory was. And Constantine is a successful general, and he has a seizure of power. And it's at that point in 312 that he says he's going to patronize one particular church, but he's also still patronizing pagan organizations. And he's also minting coins, which are, again, the sound bites of antiquity, coins that have the image of the unconquered sun, which is a pagan deity, on them. And P.S., he's dealing with a political culture in which the emperor himself is divine, is sort of on the lowest level of divinity, because the idea of divinity is not like two polar opposites, humanity and divinity, the way we think of it. Divinity is graduated, and it spans heaven and earth, and planets are divine, and stars are divine, and gods are divine, and demons are divine, and spirits are divine, and the Roman emperor is divine. And Constantine never disavows his own divinity. So it's a complicated kind of Christianity, right?
I mean, it certainly is, because it's this. You're dealing with, again. It's fascinating because when you understand. Obviously you know this extremely well, but the little bit that I know is that the Mediterranean world at this time was really, really diverse, and it had a lot of things going on in different parts of the Mediterranean. And so you're getting all of this, especially when you have things like trade and how they would interact with one another from different parts across the Mediterranean on the north south side. And you just have this exchange not only of goods or exchange of different things, but you also have this exchange of ideas and beliefs, and so you start to see like how dynamic it is. And so you have these ideas that Constantine has of himself and all these ideas, and it just becomes really, really fascinating, and almost like it's there's no bottom to it. You can kind of keep learning about these things from these time periods, which is fascinating.
I'm still learning about it, and I've been working on it for decades. I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, it's fast. It really is fascinating. So you talk about let me see if I get this right. Asceticism, or how do I say this?
Asceticism.
Asceticism, excuse me. Yeah, these ascetic traditions in the 2nd to 5th centuries, and how there were many various interpretations. Maybe tell us about this, what this was, and how it was important in this period, and how this continues to sort of impact Christianity even still today.
Well, asceticism comes from the Greek term ascesis, which means it's athletic training. It's what you undergo if you're training to be in an athletic competition. And historians generate the term asceticism to describe the cultural impulse of disciplining the flesh for the good of the soul, which is how it was thought of, or for the good of the mind. Plutarch, who's an early Roman writer, talks about how he writes a letter to a young married couple saying they should be sure only to have sex for the purpose of procreation and for no other purpose, because otherwise it wouldn't be philosophical. And I'm sure, I certainly hope the young couple just ignored what he was saying, but it's that idea that the more you discipline the flesh, the better, the clearer you think, the clearer that you, the more tuned in your soul is to the ultimate realities, the further you get away from the flesh. So you have evolutions then of people promising to be perpetual virgins, or people who are going to, if it's too late to be a virgin, then they'll be continent for the rest of their lives. And then you have people who are the real celebrities who do these grandiose gestures. My favorite is Simon Stylites, who's a Syrian. He sits on a column in Syria and ends up, there were 2,000 people at the foot of his column admiring him, where he's exposed to the elements, year in and year out, and he's so theatrically aesthetic that he has tremendous cultural throw weight. And he ends up, the Pope and the Emperor end up sending him letters asking him what's up, because again, the more you discipline the flesh, the more tuned in you're supposed to be to spiritual realities, the stronger it makes you interiorly. The less you eat, the less you sleep, and certainly sex is off the table. And we get wonderful stories about Christians doing all sorts of things. And we also get Christians accusing other Christians of only pretending to act like that, but actually being profligate. So, again, but that's asceticism on standing on one leg.
Yeah, how does that, do you think, what's the kind of ripple effect that had throughout Christianity, throughout the centuries, if any? I mean, was this kind of, contained to the time in the kind of early, second to third, fourth, fifth centuries? Or do we see ripple effects of that, post-schism into the modern, but even into after Reformation, or no, is it just more a historical thing? Or is there some tradition there that kind of persists?
Well, the last time I checked, the Catholic clergy takes vows of celibacy. Right?
That's a good point, yeah.
Yeah. There's a reason for that. Now, in Augustine's period, you have bishops who are married and they have sons, and the sons become bishops too. You still have married clergy, even in the higher registers. And it's really a very slow growth of normalizing celibacy. It really, I think, takes till the 12th century. And then that's when you get the idealization and the institutionalization of celibacy, and the Catholic Church is still dealing with that.
Yeah. So, kind of to put it all together here, you have in the 4th and 5th centuries, you have these kind of Orthodox Christians interacting with pagans and Jews and heretics throughout the Mediterranean, as we've been talking about, and how Christianity was multiple things in multiple places. And so I guess kind of the big thing here is how can we accurately understand that right after the death of Christ in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, for a long time, there's not one Christianity. There are multiple Christianities, and that there are many, many things that are being talked about and espoused. And how do we understand that? And I guess what is that? Why is that important to know? I guess for Christians today, but even just for folks generally about the kind of one of the biggest religions in the world, to know this about this kind of early period of Christianity?
Well, I think the easiest way to grasp it is to look at the situation in the 21st century. We have Baptists, we have Catholics, we have Coptic Christians, we have Kentucky snake handlers, we have the Pope, right? Christianity has never been one single thing, and it certainly isn't one single thing now. These different groups have different traditions, different creeds, different theologies, different histories, in a sense. So again, I think what it does is cushion the shock of the Protestant Reformation, because it wasn't like there was one stable type of Catholicism and then suddenly you have a counter-tradition of Protestantism, because a lot of early Lutheran Protestantism is more Catholic than other forms of Protestantism will eventually be. So again, it's Christianity is a biblical religion that's incredibly vigorously various. And it's true right now in the 21st century, and it was no less true in the first and second centuries.
Yes, it's very, very good to keep that kind of perspective there. Paula, this is such a wonderful conversation. I've really, really enjoyed this. This was again, this is sort of I have a history with studying theology and Christianity, so it kind of scratches that itch. I still really enjoy the kind of the art and the science and the scholarship that is with these types of things. And so you're just doing great work, and so your book is great. So I greatly appreciate you coming on the podcast and telling us all about your important work.
Thank you, and thank you so much for this conversation. You've made me think.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay.